What's up everyone, Dr. Q here, and we're here today to answer a simple question, that is, what is a AAA game anyway? Now, there are many ways in which you can answer this question. Let's go ahead and get the ones that make little to no sense out of the way, and that is by determining the AAA-ness, I guess, of a game by the publisher that put them out. So what are these quote-unquote AAA publishers? That would include Sony Interactive Entertainment, Microsoft Studios, Activision Blizzard, Nintendo, Electronic Arts, that is EA, Bandai Namco, and Ubisoft. What makes these AAA publishers, or again quote-unquote AAA publishers, is how much they bring in revenue combined with the type of games that they usually put out, and how these games are often considered as AAA games by both critics and players alike. But that doesn't really make much sense. Just because you have a game that was published by one of these major studios does not necessarily mean that the game itself is AAA. For example, Microsoft, yes, they've published Halo and Gears of War, etc., but they also put out things like Loco Cycle, like Dance Central, like Ori and the Blind Forest, all great games in themselves, but certainly not what anyone would call AAA. Likewise, EA publishes The Sims, Ubisoft has the South Park games and Child of Light, and Nintendo has, I don't know, whatever they're putting out in the 3DS, I guess. Now, this doesn't mean that these games are terrible or whatever. It just means that these games are not what most people, critics and gamers alike, would consider AAA. So we do have publishers that put out games that are not AAA, or at least not broadly considered AAA. So suggesting that a game is AAA simply by the studio that published it, that's not going to work. Now, the second way of thinking about what makes a AAA game AAA, and I actually kind of like this approach, it's when we consider how much the game costs to make. When we consider AAA games as those having the highest budget for visuals, for mechanics, for sound design, for narrative design, for marketing, etc. And depending on who you ask, whether it's a developer, a scholar, or a critic, they will give you different number ranges, but a good average is around $85 million. If a game costs around $85 million to make or more, then it's considered a AAA game. So that would include games like New Super Mario Brothers, Call of Duty, God of War, Skyrim, GTA 5, Smash, etc. All of those games, because of how much they cost, would be considered AAA. Then you have games that are in the AA tier, and again, designers and scholars, etc. will give you different number ranges, but a good average is around $65 to $70 million. If a game costs anywhere between there and $85 million, that is something like Prototype, something like Darksiders, something like Bayonetta, Left 4 Dead, if I recall correctly, falls under this criteria. Those games would count as AA games. Then you have your A range, like your A games, and this range is pretty broad. Again, the numbers fluctuate depending on who you ask, but a good rule of thumb is if it's anywhere between $20 million and around $60 to $65 million, if your game costs that much to make, it's what it would be called an A game. And anything below that would likely be considered B, C, D, or F, depending on the quality of the game. Are there any bugs? Are there any blurring errors in coding, in narrative, in gameplay experience, etc. Now, this is a pretty good way of breaking down what a AAA game is, but it's not infallible. You see, one of the criteria for considering the lower games, whether they fall into A, B, C, D, etc., is whether they are of good quality or not. One of the criteria is how many bugs do they have. But if we consider games like the Elder Scrolls, Skyrim, Oblivion, etc., games from the Fallout franchise, which in release have game-breaking bugs, have errors in coding that could make you lose your save, and yet cost more than $95–100 million to make, are these games AAA, or are they B, C, or D level games? You see that the games did cost a lot, but they also have qualities of those lower budget games. Furthermore, there's always the consideration that when we say AAA, people, whether it's gamers, critics, or scholars, have an idea of what a AAA game should be. There's a certain aesthetic, a certain feel to what a AAA game is that may not necessarily be conveyed via how much it costs to make. So a few cases in point include Too Human. That's a game that a lot of gamers and critics alike shunned because of their quality. Games like Disney Infinity, that cost $105 million to make, and yet most people would not think, hey, this is a AAA game. And if I recall correctly, the original Pokemon game on the Game Boy, Pokemon Red/Blue, just barely hitting most critics' threshold of 79 million, making it a AAA game, but is it really? So this takes us to the other mode of answering the question, the other thing that we could look at as to what is a AAA game, and that's what we call AAA quality. Admittedly, the answer to this question is a bit subjective, changes from person to person, but broadly speaking, it involves cutting-edge visuals, games that include whatever is the most up-to-date in terms of the technology available at the time. Games with high fidelity, with high definition, with particle effects and physics engines, with complex gameplay mechanics. Depending on who you are, you might consider that there needs to be some kind of progression system as well, and it needs to be open in some kind of way, either by having an open world, open gameplay, an open narrative. Right, there's a list of elements that people have that say, hey, it's a AAA game if it has, 5 of these 10 qualities that I look for in a AAA game. And then you start considering games like LA Noire, which cost $56 million to make. $54 million to make, failing to meet even the AA mark, but still featuring very high quality, high definition visuals for the year in which it was published, 2010, featuring a very compelling narrative. And while the gameplay mechanics were essentially a step above QTE, they were serviceable for the narrative. This is what we call a AAA quality game. It's a game that didn't cost the 70 or 80 million dollars to make, but that do meet this criteria of quote-unquote AAA-ness. Games like Watch Dogs, which cost $70 million to make, making it, by most estimates, a AA game. It's actually considered a AAA game by most people because of the high fidelity graphics, the open world, the complex game mechanics, the open narrative, etc. While Disney Infinity, which again cost $105 million, is not considered a AAA game by almost anyone, unless I guess you're an industry economics analyst type person. So what's the point of all this rant? I guess the point is to say that it doesn't really matter what we call a game in terms of whether it actually is or not AAA. What I'm trying to say is that we each have different ideas of what a very high quality game should be. And to a lot of us, The Witcher 3, for example, would be that high quality kind of level of standard. And sometimes you might have a game that was developed with a small budget that meets that criteria. And in those cases, when you have these independent titles that cost, $10-20 million to make, but do have those high fidelity visuals, the high quality, the open narrative or open world, the complex storytelling or game mechanics, or whatever other criteria you think a AAA game should have. When we have these games, we do call them AAA quality games. That doesn't mean that these games cost $285 million to make, like Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2. It just means that they are very high quality and that they do compete with these other games that did have that multi-million-dollar budget in hand. So that's it for this discussion, and I'll see you next time, maybe with some conversation about what's going on in the comments here. Have a good one, and I'll see you next time.